The night was still and quiet in the neglected part of town, where streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts. Inside his patrol car, Officer Dave Miller tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. The hum of the car's engine was the only thing keeping him awake, as his shift dragged on with nothing to break the monotony. He glanced at the clock. 3 more hours until his shift ended. The silence gnawed at him. Dave had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, but he'd long since stopped seeing any potential in it. To him, it was a place filled with people who never tried to better their lives, always blaming others for their problems. In his mind, this was where trouble came from, and he had no sympathy for the people who lived here. His eyes scanned the dimly lit streets. Run-down buildings, graffiti-covered walls, and shuttered windows. Nothing ever changed. He let out a heavy sigh, wishing for something to shake up the night, anything to keep him from the boredom. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Standing outside a closed corner store was an elderly black woman. She was hunched over slightly, leaning on a cane, with a plastic grocery bag hanging from her hand. An oversized coat covered her small frame, and a wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over her face. Dave squinted at her, his instincts flaring. What was she doing out here this late? She looked too old, too frail to be wandering around these streets at this hour, but something about her made him suspicious. To Dave, her mere presence was enough to warrant concern. He narrowed his eyes, letting his mind race. Maybe she was loitering, or worse, involved in something illegal. He'd seen it before, the people who seemed harmless at first glance, but always had something to hide. His gut told him this woman was trouble, and over the years, Dave had learned to trust his gut. Without a second thought, he pulled his squad car to a stop across the street, his gaze fixed on the woman. She wasn't doing much, just standing there, occasionally shifting her weight from one leg to the other. But that was enough for him. No one had any business being out here at this hour, especially not her. If you don't like racism, subscribe, or otherwise you're a racist. Dave exhaled through his nose, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of what was about to happen. This was his moment, another chance to assert his authority. He enjoyed these interactions, the feeling of control, of making people remember who was in charge. Swinging the door open, he stepped out of the car. His boots hit the pavement with a thud that echoed in the quiet night. The woman didn't move, didn't react to his approach, which only irritated him more. As he crossed the street, he noticed how calm she seemed, standing there like she had all the time in the world. That wasn't how it was supposed to work. Most people got nervous when they saw a cop heading toward them, especially in this part of town. But not her. "Hey," Dave called out, his voice cutting through the silence. The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just stared at him with a calmness that made his skin crawl. Dave stopped a few feet in front of her, towering over her frail form. Up close, she looked even older than he'd thought. Her skin was deeply wrinkled, her hands thin and bony, clutching the plastic bag and cane. Her clothes looked worn and secondhand, and yet she seemed unbothered by his presence. That set him on edge. "What are you doing here?" Dave demanded, his tone sharp, full of authority. He expected an answer right away, but the woman simply blinked at him, her expression unchanged. "I asked you a question," he said, stepping closer, trying to impose his presence. "You got ID?" The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I'm just on my way home." "Home?" Dave scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "It's after midnight. You shouldn't be out here loitering like this. What's in the bag?" The woman glanced down at the plastic bag in her hand, then looked back up at him. "Just some groceries," she said evenly, lifting the bag slightly as if to show him. Dave wasn't satisfied. Her calmness, her refusal to be intimidated, it was getting under his skin. He'd dealt with people like this before, people who didn't know their place, who didn't respect the uniform. And this woman, standing here like she had nothing to be afraid of, made him want to push harder. "Show me what's inside," Dave ordered, his voice dropping lower, more menacing now. The woman sighed, her tired eyes watching him with a look of quiet patience. She slowly lifted the bag, revealing a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few canned goods. Nothing suspicious, but that wasn't the point. "That's all you're carrying?" Dave asked, disbelief dripping from his words. He looked around, making sure no one else was watching, though he could feel a few lingering eyes from the shadows. The woman didn't respond, just nodded. Dave's grip tightened on his flashlight as his frustration boiled over. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. He had to do something to reassert his authority. "Let me see your ID," he demanded again, more forcefully this time. The woman didn't hesitate. She reached into her coat, slowly pulling out a worn wallet. Without a word, she handed him her ID. Dave snatched it from her hand, glancing at the name and address. Anita Johnson. Local address. Nothing suspicious. But that didn't matter. Something about this woman wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. Dave handed the ID back to Anita with a sharp flick of his wrist. His eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer. He wasn't satisfied with her answers, and the quiet confidence in her demeanor irritated him more than he cared to admit. "Why are you really out here?" he growled. "I don't buy your story." Anita looked up at him, her eyes calm but sharp, like she could see right through him. "I told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home." The calmness in her voice only added fuel to the fire simmering in Dave's chest. He wasn't used to people, especially someone like her, an older black woman, fragile and unassuming, standing up to him. He was used to fear. He was used to control, and right now, he felt that control slipping through his fingers. Dave stepped closer until their faces were just inches apart. His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "Lady, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." For a moment, the tension between them thickened. The night air felt heavy, suffocating. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Dave's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. But Anita didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her eyes locked onto his with a steady, unblinking gaze. It unnerved him, that unwavering calm. She spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Officer, I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've worn that badge. I know these streets better than most. And standing outside a closed store isn't a crime." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Dave gritted his teeth, trying to push down the surge of anger rising in his chest. How dare she speak to him like that? Like she was his equal? Like she wasn't afraid of him? "You should know better than to stand out here at this hour," Dave spat, taking another step forward, so close now that their shoes nearly touched. "You know what happens in this neighborhood. It's not safe, especially not for someone like you." Anita tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together in a thoughtful line. She didn't seem fazed by his threats. In fact, she looked almost bored. "I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer," she replied, her voice steady. "Standing out here isn't one of them." The words stung, though Dave didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the way she said them, with an air of calm confidence that made him feel small, insignificant. He wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to people treating him like he didn't matter. Dave took another step, his body tense with barely restrained anger. He could see the fine lines in Anita's face, the gray strands of hair peeking out from under her hat. She looked tired, worn out from life, but she didn't look scared, and that made him furious. "You don't tell me what to do," Dave hissed, his face just inches from hers now. "You're in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you remember that." Anita looked at him carefully, studying him in a way that made him even more uncomfortable. Her silence, her calmness. It was as if she could see right through him, past the uniform, past the badge, to something deeper. "I'm not disrespecting you, officer," she said quietly. "I'm just not afraid of you." That did it. Dave's vision blurred with rage. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. How dare she? How dare this old woman stand there and act like she wasn't intimidated by him? Like she didn't respect the power he held? "You should be," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. His hand twitched near his belt, where his flashlight hung, a silent threat. "You don't know who you're messing with." For a brief moment, Anita's eyes flicked down, noticing the movement of his hand. But she didn't back away. She didn't even blink. "You don't know who you're talking to, Officer Miller," she said softly. Dave's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said his name, his full name, sent a jolt of unease through him. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. She must have seen the name on his badge. That had to be it. But the small seed of doubt planted itself in the back of his mind, gnawing at him. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he spat, the venom in his voice barely concealed. "You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that, like you're better than me?" "I never said that," Anita replied calmly, her eyes unwavering. "I'm just trying to get home." The word sent a fresh wave of anger crashing through Dave. He stepped even closer, until there was almost no space between them. "You're lying," he snapped. "I know you are. I can see it in your eyes." Anita's gaze didn't falter. "And what do you see in my eyes, Officer Miller?" For the first time, Dave found himself at a loss for words. What did he see in her eyes? He didn't know. All he knew was that she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. She wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. And that was throwing him off balance. "You're not walking away from this," he said, his voice trembling slightly now, betraying the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm going to make sure of that." But even as he said the words, he felt the hollow emptiness behind them. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what would happen next, and that terrified him. Dave Miller's breath was coming in shallow, frustrated bursts. He couldn't comprehend how this frail old woman was standing up to him without so much as a flinch. The streets were eerily quiet around them, as if the whole city was holding its breath. He could feel a few eyes on him, shadows watching from nearby buildings, but nobody stepped forward. Anita's calm gaze stayed locked on his, and that just made the fury inside him burn hotter. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "Why are you acting like you're untouchable? You're not. I can arrest you right now and nobody would care." Anita's eyes didn't waver. "You could," she said quietly, her voice calm as ever. "But would that make you feel better, Officer Miller?" The question hit him like a slap in the face. Make him feel better? He had never questioned his motives before. He was the law. People didn't talk back to him. They feared him, respected him. That's how it had always been. But her question lingered in the air, forcing him to confront something he didn't want to admit. "I'm not walking away from this," Dave growled, but his voice cracked slightly. He tried to cover it with more force. "You're going to learn your place, and I'm going to make sure you do." Anita remained silent, watching him with those same steady eyes. And that silence was more infuriating than any argument she could have made. She wasn't going to fight him. She didn't have to. She was standing her ground without even raising her voice. Dave's hands twitched at his sides, the need to assert dominance growing stronger with every second of silence. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the rational part of his brain that was screaming at him to stop. He couldn't stand how she was making him feel. Powerless. Insignificant. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded again, his voice almost pleading now. "Why won't you just cooperate?" Anita blinked, her gaze never leaving his. "Because I don't have to, Officer Miller. I haven't done anything wrong." Something snapped inside Dave. He couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, his hand shot out, grabbing Anita's thin arm. He yanked her toward him with more force than necessary, her body jerking awkwardly. Her cane wobbled, and she shifted her weight to keep herself steady. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Dave hissed, his face inches from hers. His fingers dug into her arm, his grip tight, too tight. "You think I'm going to let you walk away after disrespecting me?" Anita's gaze flicked down to where his hand gripped her arm, then back up to his face. She didn't cry out, didn't struggle, didn't show the fear he expected. Instead, she just looked at him, her eyes filled with something different. Disappointment. "Let go of me," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Dave's grip tightened even further, his fingers pressing into her skin hard enough to bruise. A voice in the back of his mind told him to stop, to pull back before things got worse, but he ignored it. The anger, the frustration, it was all too much. "No!" he spat, pulling her even closer, their faces almost touching now. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You're in my neighborhood and I run things here." Anita didn't back down. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on his, and then she spoke again, her voice as calm as ever. "Is this really about me, Officer Miller, or is this about you?" Her words cut through him, sharper than any physical blow. For a moment he froze, her question hanging in the air like a weight he couldn't shake. It was like she could see right through him, past the uniform, past the badge, into something he had buried deep inside. "What was this really about?" "Shut up," he growled, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You don't know anything about me." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her silence was deafening, like she had already said everything that needed to be said. Dave's pulse thundered in his ears, his body shaking with the weight of his own anger. "You're not walking away from this," he snarled, his voice louder now, cracking under the pressure. "I'm going to make sure of that." Anita remained still, her eyes never leaving his. Her calmness, her refusal to bend to his authority, it was a challenge, and Dave didn't know how to handle it. His mind raced, searching for some way to regain control, some way to force her to react. And then he did the unthinkable. His free hand came up, and before he could stop himself, he threw a punch. It happened so fast, his fist connected with the side of her face, harder than he had intended. The sound of the impact seemed to echo in the quiet night, reverberating in his ears. Anita stumbled, her cane falling to the ground as she struggled to keep her balance. She didn't cry out, didn't scream. She just wiped the corner of her mouth where a small trickle of blood had appeared. For a brief, sickening moment, Dave felt a rush of satisfaction. He had broken her. He had made her understand who was in charge. But that feeling vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold wave of dread. Anita straightened up slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't look at him right away, and when she did, her gaze was calm. Too calm. But this time, there was something else in her eyes, something that made Dave's stomach churn. Disappointment. "You're going to regret that," she said quietly, her voice steady. Dave's heart sank. The certainty in her voice sent a chill down his spine, and for the first time he felt a flicker of fear. Dave Miller stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind reeling from what he had just done. The punch, the sound of it, the feeling of it, echoed in his head, louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. But the calmness in Anita's voice after she stood up, the certainty with which she spoke, cut through that noise. "You're going to regret that." For the first time in his career, Dave felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. It was brief, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, whispering that something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the sense that the ground was about to collapse beneath him. Anita didn't flinch as she wiped away the blood from her lip. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate, as though she had been through this before. But it was her eyes, the way they looked at him, that unnerved Dave the most. There was no fear, no pain, just cold, calculated understanding. She reached into her coat pocket slowly, and for a moment, Dave's instincts kicked in. His hand shot toward his gun, but he hesitated. Something told him this wasn't what he thought it was. He watched, his pulse racing, as Anita pulled out a small black leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. A gold and silver FBI badge. Dave's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the badge in disbelief. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He blinked, hoping it was some kind of trick, but the badge remained, reflecting the dim streetlight. Anita's voice cut through the fog in his brain, calm and authoritative. Special Agent Anita Jacobs, FBI, undercover. The world tilted around Dave. His mind screamed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had hit an FBI agent, not just any old woman standing on the street, a federal agent, undercover. The realization hit him like a truck, his stomach lurching with panic. "Undercover?" he croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Anita's eyes locked onto his, her expression still calm. "That's right, Officer Miller. And you just made a very, very big mistake." Dave felt the ground give way beneath him. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't move. There was nowhere to go. Nothing he could do. His mind was racing, trying to come up with some excuse, some explanation that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing. He had hit her, assaulted her, in plain view of whoever had been watching. And now she was standing there, an FBI agent, holding his fate in her hands. The dread that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind suddenly took over. His throat tightened, and for the first time in his life, Dave Miller felt utterly powerless. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice weak, almost pleading. "I didn't know who you were." Anita's gaze didn't waver. "It doesn't matter, Officer Miller. What matters is what you did. You assaulted a federal agent, and I promise you, you're going to answer for that." Dave's knees felt weak, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear her words. How had he gotten here? This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one in control. He was the one who made people afraid, who had the power. But now, standing there in front of Anita, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Anita took a step toward him, her eyes locked onto his, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "Backup is on the way, Officer Miller, and when they get here, you're going to be arrested. You're going to answer for what you've done. Your career? It's over." Dave's mind raced, but there was no escaping it now. The cold truth of her words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His career, everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was crumbling before his eyes. The distant sound of sirens cut through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Dave's heart sank. He had heard those sirens countless times before, always a signal that backup was coming, that help was on the way. But now those sirens weren't for him. They were for her. Dave tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing he could say. Nothing that would change what was about to happen. Anita watched him for a moment longer, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and cold, professional detachment. "You should have known better," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have known who you were dealing with." The sirens were getting closer now, and Dave could feel his time slipping away. His hands trembled at his sides, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Anita turned away from him, pulling her phone from her pocket. She spoke calmly into it, her voice fading as Dave's world closed in around him. In the distance, the flashing lights of the police cars appeared, and the sound of the sirens became deafening. Dave stood frozen, his legs locked in place, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what was about to happen. He wasn't the enforcer anymore. He wasn't the one in control. And for the first time in his life, Dave Miller was about to find out what it felt like to be on the other side of the law. That night, Agent Sarah Blake sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the cold light of the city reflecting off the glass of the high-rise window. The view was familiar. Skyscrapers, neon signs flickering in the distance, the hum of traffic far below. But tonight, it felt different. Everything seemed distant, almost unreal. She had spent months immersed in this case, living a double life, always one step away from danger, and now it was over, or at least this part of it was. She stared at her untouched glass of wine on the coffee table, the deep red liquid shimmering in the low light. The events of the day weighed heavily on her mind, replaying like a loop she couldn't escape. They had won, yes. Lieutenant Greg Hannon was behind bars, and his network of corrupt officers had begun to unravel. But as satisfying as it was to see him in handcuffs, there was a hollowness to the victory. The price had been high. Ryan Steele, the key to bringing down Hannon's entire operation, was dead. Sarah had seen death before. She'd been in the FBI long enough to know the cost of these investigations. But there was something about Steele's death that gnawed at her, something that wouldn't let her rest. He had been corrupt, yes, a man who had abused his power and taken advantage of a broken system. But in those final moments, before Hannon silenced him for good, he had shown a glimmer of remorse, a desire to do the right thing. That was what haunted her most. He had been ready to turn on Hannon, to give them everything they needed to take down the corrupt network within the police department. And now, he was gone. Just another casualty in a system designed to protect itself at all costs. The image of Steele's lifeless body lying in the cold, empty cell flashed through her mind again. She had found him too late. If she had arrived just a few hours earlier, maybe things would have been different. Maybe he would have had the chance to testify, to tell his side of the story. But Hannon had gotten to him first, and now Steele's secrets would die with him. Sarah pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on the bigger picture. Hannon was in custody. His empire was crumbling. The team had raided his office, seized his files, and arrested several of his associates. The case was airtight. There was no way he could wiggle out of this one. But as satisfying as that was, it didn't bring her the sense of closure she had hoped for. Hannon's arrest was just the beginning. The rot within the department went far deeper than one man, and Sarah knew that even with him out of the picture, there were others waiting to take his place. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Agent Collins, her longtime partner on the case. "We made a difference today. Get some rest. You deserve it." Sarah read the message, her lips curving into a small, tired smile. Collins had always been the optimistic one, the steady presence that kept her grounded during the investigation. He had been her sounding board, her partner in the trenches, the one who could still find hope when things seemed darkest. She appreciated his attempt to lift her spirits, but she wasn't sure if she could rest just yet. She typed a quick response. "Thanks, you too." But even as she sent the message, she felt the gnawing doubt creep back in. Had they really made a difference? Hannon's arrest would make headlines, sure, but Sarah knew how these things worked. The media would have a field day with the story for a few weeks, maybe a month, and then something else would come along to steal the spotlight. The public's attention would shift, and the deeper issues, the systemic corruption that had allowed Hannon and men like him to thrive, would remain. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples as the weight of it all pressed down on her. She had spent months infiltrating Hannon's world, pretending to be someone she wasn't, gathering evidence while knowing that at any moment the whole operation could blow up in her face. The stress of living a double life had taken its toll. There were nights when she had lain awake, wondering if she would make it out alive, if the badge she wore would be enough to protect her when the time came. The case had been intense from the start. Going undercover to investigate a corrupt police department had its own unique set of dangers. The men she had been investigating weren't just criminals. They were law enforcement officers, men who knew the system inside and out, men who could manipulate evidence, silence witnesses, and make problems disappear. Hannon had been the worst of them all. He had been running his operation for years, carefully cultivating a network of officers who were loyal to him above all else. And in the process, he had built a fortress of corruption that had seemed impenetrable. But Sarah had found a way in. It had started with small things, anonymous tips, whispers from officers who had grown tired of Hannon's reign. But it wasn't until Ryan Steele came into the picture that things began to shift. Steele had been one of Hannon's most trusted men, a cop who had built his career on the backs of those he was supposed to protect. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Sarah didn't know if it was guilt or fear or something else entirely, but Steele had reached out to them, offering to talk, offering to expose Hannon's operation. It had been a dangerous gamble, one that had ultimately cost Steele his life. Sarah could still remember the look in his eyes the night before he died, the fear and uncertainty that had flickered behind his tough exterior. He had been on the verge of flipping, ready to give them everything they needed to take down Hannon. But he had been too late, and Hannon had silenced him before he could talk. That's what haunted her most. The thought of how close they had come, and how quickly it had all fallen apart. She stood up, walking over to the window and staring out at the city below. The streets were quieter now, the protests from earlier in the day having died down, but the tension in the air was still palpable. The community had been on edge for years, simmering with anger and frustration over the abuses of power that had gone unchecked for so long. Hannon's arrest had been a turning point, a chance for the people to finally see justice being served, but Sarah knew that for many, it wouldn't be enough. There were still others like Hannon out there, still officers who believed they were untouchable, and that's what made her uneasy. She had seen it before. Corrupt systems rarely collapsed all at once. Even when the figurehead was removed, the machinery kept grinding on. Hannon's arrest was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Special Agent Harris, her supervisor. She hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing that whatever he had to say would likely add to the weight on her shoulders. "Blake," Harris's voice came through the line, rough and tired. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she replied, though the exhaustion in her voice was hard to hide. "Just processing everything." "Yeah," Harris said, a long pause following his words. "Listen, I wanted to tell you personally. We're pulling in more of Hannon's guys. The ledger you found in his office, it's going to take down more than just him. We've already started making arrests." Sarah felt a surge of relief at the news. The ledger. That small leather-bound notebook had been a goldmine of evidence. Inside were names, dates, and payments. A detailed record of every dirty deal Hannon had made, every officer who had been on his payroll. It was the key to dismantling the entire corrupt network. "That's good," Sarah said, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time all night. "That's really good." "It is," Harris agreed. "But we're not done yet. There's still more to uncover. Hannon might be the head of the snake, but there are plenty of others who have been feeding off this for years. We've got a long road ahead of us." Sarah nodded, even though Harris couldn't see her. "I know." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing the next steps in the investigation, before Harris signed off, urging her to get some rest. But Sarah knew she wouldn't be sleeping much tonight. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what needed to be done next. She wandered back to the couch, her thoughts drifting once again to Steele. What if he had lived? What if he had been able to testify, to take the stand and tell the world what he knew? Would it have made a difference? Or would the system have chewed him up and spit him out, just like it had so many others before him? Steele had been a complex figure, and Sarah found it hard to reconcile the different sides of him. He had been a bad cop, no doubt about it. But in his final moments, he had shown something more, a desire for redemption, a glimmer of humanity that had been buried under years of corruption. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that, in another life, things could have been different for him. She took a deep breath, trying to clear her head. It was no use dwelling on what-ifs. Steele was gone, and nothing would change that. But his death had exposed the cracks in the system, and now it was up to her and her team to make sure those cracks didn't widen into something worse. The thought brought her some measure of peace, but it also filled her with a sense of responsibility that weighed heavy on her shoulders. The case was far from over. There were still arrests to be made, still officers who needed to answer for their actions. And Sarah knew that as long as there was corruption to root out, she wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting a soft glow across the room. Sarah picked up her glass of wine and took a slow sip, savoring the bitter taste. She thought of the protests earlier that day, of the people who had taken to the streets demanding justice. They had every right to be angry, every right to demand accountability. And now, with Hannon behind bars and his network crumbling, they had finally been heard. But Sarah also knew that the fight wasn't over. It would take time, years maybe, to fully dismantle the corruption that had infected the department. But she was ready for it. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. The phone buzzed again, another message from Collins. This time it was just 2 words. "Good job." Sarah smiled, setting the phone down and leaning back in her chair. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, even if just for a moment. The work would still be there tomorrow, but tonight, she would rest. And when the sun rose again, she would be ready to keep fighting. For Steele, for the people who had been hurt by the system, and for the future they were trying to build. One where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. The next morning, Agent Sarah Blake woke to a strange feeling of calm. For months, her life had been consumed by the investigation, by the constant pressure of undercover work, and the ever-present danger of being found out. But now, with Lieutenant Greg Hannon in custody and the corrupt network within the police department crumbling, there was a sense of finality, even if the fight wasn't entirely over. She sat up in bed, blinking against the soft light filtering through the curtains. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she reached for it, half expecting more updates on the case. Instead, it was a message from Agent Collins. "Press conference today at noon. You coming?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair as she stared at the screen. The press conference. It was inevitable, of course. Hannon's arrest was already headline news, and the public was demanding answers. The department needed to address the situation, to show that they were serious about rooting out the corruption that had taken hold for years. But Sarah had never liked the spotlight. She preferred to work in the background, quietly doing what needed to be done without the fanfare that came with public recognition. Still, this wasn't just about her. The people of the city needed to see that justice was being served, that the FBI was holding the corrupt officers accountable. She couldn't shy away from that, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. She sent a quick reply to Collins. "I'll be there." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Sarah showered, dressed in her sharpest suit, and tried to push down the nervous energy building in her chest. As she made her way to the federal building where the press conference was being held, she could already see the gathering crowd outside, the media, protesters, and curious onlookers who had heard about the arrests. When she arrived, Special Agent Harris was already at the podium, giving his statement to the press. His voice was steady, his words measured as he outlined the key points of the investigation. Hannon's arrest, the corrupt officers who had been brought in, and the commitment of the FBI to continue their efforts in cleaning up the department. Sarah stood just off to the side, watching as the cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Harris maintained his calm demeanor. He was good at this, she realized, good at being the face of the operation, at presenting the facts in a way that reassured the public that everything was under control. But as she listened to his speech, Sarah couldn't help but feel that something was missing. When the press conference ended, reporters swarmed Harris, shouting for more details, more answers. Collins made his way over to her, his face lit up with that familiar grin that never seemed to fade, even in the darkest of situations. "Hell of a show, huh?" he said, nodding toward the crowd. Sarah smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, it's something." Collins raised an eyebrow, sensing her hesitation. "You good?" She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. It feels like we're not telling the whole story. Hannon's arrest is huge, but this corruption didn't start with him, and it's not going to end with him either. I wish the public understood that." Collins glanced back at the crowd, his expression softening. "They will in time. Right now, they need to see that we're taking action, that we're not letting this slide. But you're right, there's a lot more work to do. Sarah appreciated his honesty. That was the thing about Collins. He was always able to balance optimism with a clear-eyed view of reality. It was why they made such a good team. They spent the rest of the day in meetings, debriefing the higher-ups on the next steps in the investigation, reviewing the evidence they had gathered, and planning how to continue dismantling Hannon's network. Every piece of information they uncovered pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that had been allowed to fester for too long, unchecked by those in power. By late afternoon, Sarah was exhausted. The adrenaline from the past few days had worn off, leaving her drained both physically and mentally. She headed back to her apartment, craving nothing more than a quiet night to herself. But when she walked through the door, she found herself restless. The silence of her apartment, which had once been a welcome escape from the chaos of her job, now felt suffocating. Her mind kept circling back to the case, to the faces of the officers she had worked alongside, never knowing how deep their corruption ran. She thought of Steele, of Hannon, of the victims whose names were now etched into her memory. She needed to do something, anything, to clear her head. Grabbing her jacket, she headed out into the city. The streets were bustling with life, a stark contrast to the quiet tension that had surrounded her during the investigation. For the first time in months, she felt like an outsider, watching from the sidelines as people went about their lives, unaware of the storm that had been brewing beneath the surface. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a call from Harris. "Hey," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Blake," Harris said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately put her on edge. "We've got something new. It's big. I need you to come in." Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" "I'll explain when you get here," Harris replied, his tone clipped. "Just come to the office, now." The line went dead, and Sarah stood there for a moment, trying to process what he had just said. Something new, something big. After everything they had uncovered with Hannon, she wasn't sure how much bigger it could get, but she knew Harris well enough to know that he wouldn't call her in unless it was serious. Without hesitation, she turned and headed back to the federal building, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Harris was waiting for her in the conference room, his expression grim. Collins was there too, along with a few other agents from their team. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, taking a seat at the table. Harris didn't waste any time. "We've just intercepted a communication. It looks like Hannon wasn't acting alone." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Harris pulled up a file on his tablet, sliding it across the table for her to see. "We've been tracking his financials, looking for any offshore accounts, anything that could help us trace the money. And we found something. A series of transactions linked to a higher-up in the department. Someone we didn't have on our radar before." Sarah leaned forward, scanning the file. The name jumped out at her immediately: Captain David Matthews. He's been using his position to funnel money through shell companies, paying off politicians, covering for officers like Hannon. And from what we can tell, he's been doing it for years. Hannon was just one part of a much larger operation. Sarah felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. Captain Matthews was one of the most respected figures in the department, a man who had been hailed as a reformer, someone who was supposed to clean up the mess left by others. But now it seemed he had been playing both sides all along. "How did we miss this?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. Harris shook his head. "Matthews is smart. He's covered his tracks well, but we've got enough to start digging deeper. We're going to need a full task force on this one. It's going to take time, but we'll get him." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting into gear. This was bigger than she had anticipated, but it was exactly what she had feared. Hannon wasn't the end of it. There were others, higher up the chain, who had been pulling the strings all along. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady now, the determination back in full force. Harris leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "We start by flipping the ones we've already got. Hannon, his enforcer, anyone who can give us leverage on Matthews. We put the pressure on, and we don't stop until we have everything." Sarah took a deep breath, letting the weight of the task settle over her. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The team worked around the clock, following every lead, digging through financial records, and interviewing anyone who might have information on Matthews. It was slow, painstaking work, but with each new piece of evidence, they got closer to the truth. Hannon predictably refused to cooperate at first. But as the pressure mounted and the reality of his situation set in, he began to crack. Slowly, piece by piece, he gave them what they needed: names, dates, connections to Matthews and others within the department who had been part of the corrupt network. It was a grueling process, and there were days when Sarah felt like they were spinning their wheels, getting nowhere. But then, just when it seemed like the trail had gone cold, they got a break. One of Matthews' former associates, a detective named Chambers, had come forward with information, willing to make a deal in exchange for immunity. Chambers had been part of the inner circle, privy to the secrets Matthews had kept hidden for years. He provided them with the final piece of the puzzle: direct evidence linking Matthews to the corruption, to the payoffs, and to the cover-ups that had allowed officers like Hannon to operate with impunity. The day they arrested Matthews was surreal. Sarah watched as he was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, his face pale and drawn, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. The media was there again, just as they had been for Hannon's arrest, but this time the mood was different. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about the entire system coming down. As Matthews was driven away, Sarah felt a sense of closure that she hadn't felt with Hannon's arrest. This was the end of the line. The corruption that had infected the department for years was finally being exposed, and the people responsible were being held accountable. But even as the case came to a close, Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more corruption to root out, more battles to fight. But for now, she could rest. They had won this round, and that was enough. As she stood on the steps of the precinct, watching the sunset over the city, Sarah allowed herself to smile. They had made a difference, and that was all she had ever wanted. The following months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, interviews, and further investigations. With Captain Matthews and Lieutenant Hannon in custody, the FBI's work was far from over. The public outrage hadn't subsided, and every day brought new headlines, new revelations about the depth of the corruption that had plagued the city's police department. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of change. Change that had been slow to come, but was now inevitable. Agent Sarah Blake found herself at the center of it all, often pulled between courtrooms, strategy meetings, and community outreach efforts. Her goal was not just to dismantle the corrupt system from the inside, but also to help rebuild the shattered trust between the department and the people it was supposed to serve. Every time she stepped into the precinct, she felt the weight of years of betrayal and broken promises pressing down on her. But it was also a reminder of why the work had to be done. It was exhausting work, but it was rewarding in ways she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she felt like real change was possible, that the fight she had dedicated her life to was finally paying off. The city wasn't just watching anymore, it was demanding action. One evening, as Sarah sat in her office reviewing the latest reports, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep, there was a knock on her door. She glanced up to see Agent Harris, his familiar steady presence a welcome relief from the constant stream of demands and tension. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside before she had a chance to answer. Sarah smiled wearily, leaning back in her chair. "For you? Always." Harris took a seat across from her, placing a file on her desk. "Just came from the prosecutor's office. Matthews and Hannon have both officially agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. It's not perfect, but we're going to get what we need to take down the rest of the network." Sarah nodded. It was a win, but like many victories in her line of work, it was bittersweet. Men like Matthews and Hannon would still face justice, but they wouldn't serve the time that many might feel they deserved. Still, the information they provided would be invaluable in dismantling the remaining corrupt officers and securing long-lasting reforms within the department. "And what about the department itself?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "What's going to happen to the people who weren't involved but turn a blind eye?" Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he considered the question. "That's the harder part, isn't it? There are a lot of people who didn't commit crimes but allowed the corruption to thrive. We'll be looking at retraining, transfers, and in some cases dismissals. The mayor's office is working on forming an independent oversight committee. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight, but the tide is turning. The city's waking up." Sarah nodded, though she knew it was more complicated than that. Change, real change, was often met with resistance. There would be protests, pushback from powerful figures who had benefited from the status quo. But she also knew that the case they had built, the arrests they had made, were a turning point for the city. There was no going back now. "Speaking of change," Harris continued, his tone lightening a little, "Collins mentioned that you've been thinking about taking some time off after all this." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh, did he now?" Harris chuckled. "Well, he didn't exactly say it in so many words, but we both know you've been running on fumes for a while now. You deserve a break." Sarah considered it. For years, her life had been consumed by the job, by the constant pressure to fight against corruption, injustice, and the systems that enabled it. She had never been good at stepping away, at taking time for herself. But now, after everything that had happened, she wondered if maybe Harris was right. Maybe it was time to take a breath, to recharge before diving into the next battle. "I've thought about it," she admitted, her voice softening. "But every time I try to step back, something new pops up. It's hard to walk away when there's still so much work to be done." Harris nodded, understanding the weight she carried. "There's always going to be more work, Sarah. But you've done your part. You've led the charge on this. And it's okay to step back, even if just for a little while." Sarah smiled, appreciating his words more than she could express. She had always admired Harris for his leadership, for his ability to see the bigger picture, even when the rest of them were buried in the details. And in that moment, she realized that maybe taking time off wasn't a retreat. It was an investment in her ability to keep going. "I'll think about it," she said finally, and she meant it this time. Harris stood, his expression soft but encouraging. "Good. And when you're ready to come back, we'll have plenty more work waiting for you." Sarah laughed, the tension of the last few months lifting slightly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Harris left the office, Sarah turned her attention back to the stack of files on her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. The idea of stepping away, of taking some time to reflect and recharge, felt like a foreign concept, but it was one she knew she needed to embrace. The sun was setting outside, casting a golden hue across the city skyline. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to just sit and watch the world outside her window. It wasn't perfect. There were still battles to be fought, still people who needed to be held accountable. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Peace. She thought back to the people she had met during the investigation, the victims, the witnesses, the officers who had been caught in the crossfire of a corrupt system. She thought of Steele, of how close he had come to doing the right thing before fear and power had silenced him for good. His death still weighed on her, a reminder that even in victory, there were losses that couldn't be undone. For weeks after Steele's death, Sarah had found herself questioning her choices. Could she have pushed harder? Should she have seen the signs earlier that Hannon would move to silence Steele? It was easy to second-guess in hindsight, but she knew that no one could have predicted how fast things had spiraled. Hannon's desperation had been their undoing, but it had cost them Steele's life. His death served as a grim reminder that every step they took was fraught with danger. that the fight against corruption was never just about policies and procedures. It was about people's lives. As she sat in the growing dusk, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message, a simple text from one of her community outreach contacts. "The people haven't forgotten what you did, Sarah. They're still out there, pushing for change." Sarah's heart warmed at the message. The protests had lessened, but the energy behind them hadn't dissipated. The community had been ignited by the investigation, and now they were demanding accountability not just from the police, but from the city's entire power structure. It was the kind of momentum that Sarah knew couldn't be allowed to fade. Over the next several weeks, Sarah found herself more and more involved with community leaders. She attended town hall meetings, listening to the stories of people who had suffered under the old system. She met with activists, local politicians, and even members of the press, all of whom were eager to hear how the FBI planned to ensure lasting reform. It wasn't easy work. There were still plenty of people within the police department who resisted change, who viewed the investigation as an attack on their authority rather than an opportunity for growth. But despite the resistance, Sarah could feel a shift happening. Slowly, the city was coming to terms with the fact that this wasn't just about a few bad cops. It was about a culture that had allowed those bad cops to thrive. And now, that culture was being dismantled, brick by brick. One particularly tense meeting with the city's police union had left Sarah drained. The union leaders had come out swinging, accusing the FBI of overreach, of targeting officers without due cause. Sarah had stood her ground, presenting the facts of the investigation, the evidence they had gathered, and the systemic failures that had allowed corruption to go unchecked for so long. But it was clear that the union wasn't ready to accept the depth of the changes that were coming. After the meeting, as she walked out of the building, Mayor Riley caught up with her. The mayor had been an outspoken advocate for reform, but even she was feeling the pressure from those who wanted to preserve the status quo. "You handled that well," the mayor said, falling into step beside Sarah. "Did I?" Sarah asked, her tone wry. "Because it felt like I was banging my head against a wall." Mayor Riley smiled sympathetically. "That's how it always feels at first. Change is hard, especially for people who have benefited from the way things were. But you've got them on the defensive. They know they can't stop this. They're just trying to slow it down." Sarah nodded, though the exhaustion was starting to weigh on her. "I just hope we can keep up the momentum. The longer this drags on, the easier it will be for people to forget what we're fighting for." "They won't forget," the mayor said firmly. "Not after everything that's happened. You've given this city hope, Sarah. Don't underestimate that." As Sarah walked back to her car that evening, she found herself thinking about the mayor's words. Hope. It was such a fragile thing, easily lost and even harder to restore. But as she looked around the city, at the people who had taken to the streets demanding justice, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they had started something that couldn't be undone. Back in her apartment that night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she sorted through the events of the day. She thought of all the people she had met during the investigation, the victims of police brutality, the officers who had come forward to expose the corruption, the community leaders who had refused to give up. They had all played a part in this, and their stories had become a part of hers. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Harris. "We made a difference today. Get some rest, Sarah. You've earned it." Sarah smiled faintly as she set the phone down. She hadn't been able to rest before, but now, as the weight of the investigation began to lift, she allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were winning. She stood by her window, watching the city below as it settled into the night. The lights flickered in the distance, and somewhere she knew people were still fighting for the change they believed in. It was a long road ahead, but Sarah was ready for it. For tonight, though, she would let herself rest. Tomorrow would bring a new dawn, and with it, new challenges, but also new possibilities. As she stood there, her thoughts drifting to the future, Sarah realized something important. This fight wasn't just about taking down corrupt officers or exposing broken systems. It was about rebuilding, about creating something better, something that would last. And that, she knew, was worth every battle she had fought. In the aftermath of the investigation, the city began the difficult task of rebuilding. It wasn't just about making arrests or holding press conferences. It was about changing a culture that had allowed corruption to take root so deeply. For Agent Sarah Blake, this meant shifting from undercover work and criminal investigations to something more intangible, restoring faith in the system. A few weeks after Lieutenant Hannon's arrest, Sarah found herself back at the precinct, this time not as an undercover agent, but as part of a federal team tasked with overseeing the department's reform efforts. The air was still thick with tension, and although the worst of the protests had subsided, there was a palpable unease in the station. Officers who had once greeted her with wary glances now avoided eye contact altogether. Some resented her presence, while others seemed relieved, though they were careful not to show it too openly. The department's leadership had been gutted, leaving vacancies at every level. New faces had been brought in, reform-minded officers from other cities, trusted by the mayor and vetted by federal oversight teams. But the transition was anything but smooth. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. One day, as Sarah walked through the precinct's halls, she was stopped by Officer Mills, a veteran cop who had kept his head down during the investigation, neither complicit in the corruption nor vocal against it. He had a reputation for doing his job quietly, staying out of the fray, and avoiding the politics that had plagued the department. "Agent Blake," he called out as she passed. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah pause. She turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "Officer Mills, what can I do for you?" He hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was listening before speaking in a low voice. "I've been here for 25 years, seen this place go through a lot, but I've never seen anything like this. The guys, some of them, they're saying this cleanup is going too far, that it's making it impossible to do our jobs." Sarah crossed her arms, sensing where the conversation was headed. She'd heard similar complaints in the weeks since the arrests. "I know change is hard, Officer Mills, but this department needs to be held accountable. You know that as well as anyone." Mills nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "I'm not saying you're wrong. We had some bad eggs, no doubt about that. But it feels like now, every officer is being looked at like they're guilty of something, even the ones who had nothing to do with Hannon's crew." Sarah's gaze softened slightly. She had expected resistance, but this felt different. There was a weariness in Mills's voice that she hadn't anticipated, a sense of betrayal that went beyond anger. He was speaking for the rank-and-file officers who had been swept up in the investigation through no fault of their own. The ones who had quietly done their jobs, but now found themselves under scrutiny simply because they worked in a corrupt system. "I get it," Sarah said after a long pause. "It's not easy being on the inside, knowing you're doing the right thing but still being painted with the same brush as the ones who didn't. But accountability has to come first. If we don't fix this, if we don't change the way things are done here, the cycle will just repeat itself. And next time, it might be worse." Mills sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I get that. I do. But some of these new policies, they're tying our hands. There's more paperwork than ever, more oversight. We can't even patrol the same without a supervisor breathing down our necks. It feels like we're being watched all the time." Sarah knew the increased oversight was necessary. It was the only way to ensure that the reform stuck. But she also understood the frustration. It's going to take time for things to settle. Right now, the department is in the spotlight, and that means everyone is watching. But once the dust settles, the oversight will ease. It's about finding the right balance between accountability and trust. Mills looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of insincerity. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I hope you're right, Blake. I really do." Sarah nodded, watching as Mills turned and walked away, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the past few months had finally caught up with him. She knew there were many officers like him, good cops who had been caught in the middle, unsure of how to navigate the shifting tides of change. And it wasn't just the police who were feeling the strain. The community, too, was struggling to find its footing in the wake of the investigation. In the weeks following the arrests, Sarah had been invited to a series of community meetings hosted by local activists and city officials. The goal was to foster dialogue between the police and the people they served, to begin the process of healing and rebuilding trust. But these meetings were often tense, filled with anger, frustration, and, in some cases, hopelessness. At one such meeting, held in a local church, the room was packed with residents, most of whom had been directly affected by police misconduct. There were mothers who had lost sons, teenagers who had been harassed or wrongfully detained, community leaders who had spent years fighting against the very system that Sarah had now helped to dismantle. The air was thick with emotion as people took turns speaking, sharing their stories, venting their anger, and demanding justice. Sarah sat quietly at the back of the room, listening intently as the speaker's words filled the space. She had heard these stories before, in one form or another, but hearing them in this setting, surrounded by the raw pain of the community, gave them a new weight. These were the people she had fought for, the ones whose lives had been torn apart by the corruption she had helped expose. When it was finally her turn to speak, Sarah stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know that no apology can undo the harm that's been done," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "What happened in this department is unforgivable. People who were supposed to protect you betrayed your trust, and there's no excuse for that. But I want you to know that we are doing everything we can to make sure this never happens again. The people responsible are being held accountable, and we are working to rebuild this department from the ground up." There was a murmur of approval from some in the crowd, but others remained skeptical. One man, seated near the front, stood up and addressed her directly. "What makes you think this time will be any different?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "We've heard promises like this before. Every time something like this happens, they say they're going to fix it, but nothing ever really changes." Sarah met his gaze, understanding the deep-seated skepticism that permeated his words. "I won't pretend that change will happen overnight," she said honestly, "and I won't ask you to trust us blindly. All I can do is promise you that we are committed to making this right. The FBI is going to remain involved, and we will continue to hold this department accountable. But real change will take time, and it will require all of us, law enforcement, city officials, and the community, working together." The man didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded slowly, as if willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, if only for a moment. The meeting continued, with more people voicing their concerns and hopes for the future. By the end of the night, there was a sense that while the road ahead would be difficult, there was also a chance for healing. As Sarah left the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the real work. The conversations, the outreach, the slow process of rebuilding trust, the arrests, the investigations. Those were just the beginning. The hard part, the part that would take years, maybe even decades, was the work of changing hearts and minds, of creating a system that truly served and protected everyone. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her dual role as both an investigator and a liaison between the community and the police department. It wasn't easy, and there were days when she felt like she was being pulled in 100 different directions. But through it all, she remained focused on the goal: to ensure that what happened in her city could never happen again. One morning, as she was preparing for another long day of meetings and paperwork, she received a call from Agent Harris. His voice, though calm, carried a note of urgency. "We've uncovered something," he said. "It's about the other precincts." Sarah's heart sank as she listened to Harris explain what they had found. The corruption wasn't limited to just Hannon's precinct. There were whispers, rumors, and now evidence that similar abuses of power had been happening across the city. The fight was far from over. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the weight of the new information pressing down on her. She had known this wasn't the end, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "So what now?" she asked, her voice steady but tired. "Now," Harris replied, "we keep going. We follow the evidence, and we clean house." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. The path forward was clear, but it wasn't going to be easy. There were more battles to be fought, more systems to dismantle, and more lives to rebuild. But Sarah was ready. For her, this had never been just about one case or one corrupt officer. This was about changing a system, about making sure that the people who had been hurt could finally find justice. And if that meant fighting for as long as it took, then that's exactly what she was going to do. As she hung up the phone and prepared to dive back into the work, Sarah knew one thing for sure: the fight for justice was far from over. But she was in it for the long haul, and she wasn't going to stop until the job was done. The weeks turned into months, and as time passed, the ripples of the FBI's investigation into Lieutenant Hannon's precinct continued to spread across the city. Each day brought new revelations about officers who had quietly enabled the corruption, about policies that had been designed to shield misconduct, and about a system that had turned a blind eye to abuse for far too long. The public's appetite for accountability had not diminished, and neither had Agent Sarah Blake's resolve. Despite the progress they had made, the road to reform was far from smooth. There were still countless challenges to overcome. Inside the precinct, where some officers remained resistant to the changes, and outside in the community, where trust had been shattered and was only beginning to heal. One afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting at her desk, staring at the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated over the past few weeks. Reports, testimonies, and evidence files lay scattered across the surface, each one representing a small piece of the larger puzzle she was working to solve. But today, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment and allowing herself a brief reprieve from the constant demands of the job. In the quiet of her office, her mind drifted back to the events that had brought her here, to the day she had first gone undercover in Hannon's precinct, to the moment she had confronted Ryan Steele, and to the night she had found him dead in his cell. The memory of that night still lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, of how fragile the line between justice and corruption could be. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah opened her eyes to see Agent Harris standing in the doorway. He looked tired, the strain of the past few months etched into the lines of his face, but there was also a sense of satisfaction in his eyes, a sign that, despite everything, they were making progress. "Got a minute?" Harris asked, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. Sarah nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. "What's going on?" Harris sat down across from her, his expression serious but calm. "We've wrapped up the investigation into the other precincts. The DOJ is stepping in now. They're going to take over the broader reform efforts across the city." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean we're done here?" "Not quite," Harris replied, leaning forward slightly. "There's still work to be done in Hannon's precinct. The new leadership is in place, but they're going to need guidance, especially in the early stages. The Community Trust Initiative is also going to need oversight." Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The idea of finally seeing the investigation come to a close was appealing, but she knew that this was only the beginning of the real work. Reform didn't happen overnight, and the scars left by years of corruption wouldn't heal easily. "How's the community responding?" she asked, shifting the conversation to the people she had been most concerned about throughout the investigation. Harris leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he considered her question. "It's mixed. Some are hopeful, especially now that they're seeing real changes being made. But there's still a lot of anger, a lot of mistrust. They've been let down so many times before, and it's going to take a lot more than arrests and press conferences to fix that." Sarah nodded, already knowing the answer before she asked. And the officers? Harris's expression darkened slightly. There's resistance, as you'd expect. Most of the guys who were loyal to Hannon are gone, either arrested or retired early. But there are still a few holdouts. Officers who don't like the idea of outsiders coming in and telling them how to do their jobs. We're keeping an eye on them. Sarah wasn't surprised. She had seen the way some of the officers looked at her when she walked through the precinct, the subtle glances that spoke volumes about their resentment. They saw her as an outsider, someone who had come in and turned their world upside down. But she also knew that change was necessary, even if it made people uncomfortable. "We'll deal with it," she said, her voice steady. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there." Harris nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You've done good work here, Sarah. You should be proud of what we've accomplished." Sarah smiled faintly, though there was a heaviness behind it. "It's not over yet." "No," Harris agreed, "but we're on the right track." As Harris stood to leave, Sarah glanced out the window, watching as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the precinct, but for the city as a whole. The road ahead was still long, and there would be setbacks, but they had come this far. And for that, she was grateful. Later that evening, as Sarah walked through the neighborhood surrounding the precinct, she was struck by how different the streets felt. The tension that had once hung in the air, thick and suffocating, had begun to dissipate. The protests had ended, and in their place, there was a cautious optimism. People were talking again, not just about the corruption that had been exposed, but about what the future might hold. She passed by a small grocery store, the same store where she had first seen Ryan Steele confront an elderly woman, an encounter that had set everything in motion. The store was quiet now, its lights dimmed for the night. But Sarah couldn't help but think back to that moment, to the way Steele had looked at the woman with suspicion, to the way he had let his power blind him to the truth. Steele's death still weighed heavily on her. She had tried to help him, to offer him a way out. But in the end, he had been too far gone. The system had swallowed him whole, just as it had done to so many others. But his death had not been in vain. It had been the catalyst for change, a tragic reminder of what happened when power went unchecked. As Sarah continued walking, she spotted a group of teenagers gathered near a street corner, their laughter and conversation filling the air. For a moment she hesitated, watching them from a distance. They reminded her of the young people she had met during her undercover work, the ones who had been harassed, detained, or worse, by officers like Steele. But these kids were different. They seemed carefree, unburdened by the fear that had once defined their relationship with the police. Sarah smiled to herself, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. Change was happening, slowly but surely. And while there was still a long way to go, there was also hope. Hope that the next generation wouldn't have to grow up in a city where they were afraid of the people who were supposed to protect them. As she made her way back to her apartment, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Officer Mills, the veteran cop she had spoken to weeks ago. He had been one of the few officers to openly express his concerns about the reforms, and Sarah had respected his honesty, even if they didn't always agree. The message was short, but it brought a smile to her face. "Things are starting to feel different around here. In a good way. Thanks." Sarah tucked her phone back into her pocket, feeling a sense of quiet accomplishment. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was a sign that the work they were doing was making a difference, that even the officers who had been resistant to change were beginning to see the value in it. As she unlocked the door to her apartment and stepped inside, Sarah allowed herself a moment of peace. The city outside was still healing, still finding its way. But tonight, she could rest knowing that they were on the right path. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, she would be ready to continue the fight. Because if there was one thing Sarah Blake had learned throughout this entire ordeal, it was that justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And she was more than willing to see it through to the end.